So the floor is now open for questions. I don't know how you feel. I have already 172 questions myself and don't know how to start. So for all people online, let me reiterate, we have already a couple of questions, but everybody online is welcome to raise their questions and bring their points to the table. Now, perhaps we start with this one.
Yes, so we have one question from the audience, more specifically from Ansgar Hebborn from Roche. Actually, it's a question to Michael Berntgen. So does considering the chain of regulatory and payer decisions that you mentioned mean that EMA adopts the principles of payers for evidence extrapolation and transfer, and that EMA adopts the same level of acceptance of acceptable clinical evidence uncertainty acceptable to payers? It's a difficult question, huh?
Okay. Let me see. Where do we get this? Yeah, it's working. It's working? Yes,
Yep.
excellent.
Yep.
Right. So if Ansgar was here, I would ask him to maybe rephrase, because I'm not sure I really get the gist of the question.
But I think how I read it is that, so should EMA, I mean, do you think that EMA should adopt the same level of acceptable clinical evidence uncertainty, which is acceptable to payers, to various, to different payers?
Right. I think...
So how do you look at uncertainty, and how does it align with how the countries?
Right. The point that's really important here is that we all have decisions to be made within our specific remits, which are predefined. And we have certain methodologies which we need to bring together and see what are the overlaps where we can really address a degree of uncertainty through a single post-licensing evidence plan together. I think that's really the bottom line, what I try to convey. And in here, it's very important to look at the individual product, but before looking at the individual product, to agree also on methodologies that can help to address uncertainty. So I think there's a lot of technical work that needs to be done. And in fact, in the question, there was already a jump to another decision maker. And an important one in between is the HTA community that also looks very technically at these aspects. In fact, as the outcome also of a joint clinical assessment. And I think it's really this conversation, which then also should include experts such as clinicians, exactly, Rosa, and patient representatives, really to see how do we collectively address this best then for the individual product. But before we go there, it's really to look at the methodology that we have a good understanding. This is why I gave the example of evidence transfer or extrapolation, because I think it is a key one. If you think about rare diseases, if you think about pediatric indications and subpopulations, you need to apply this principle, but you also need to have a common understanding when and how to apply it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Any of the other panelists who also would like to comment on this one, then just take the micro.
It's not working.
Yeah, in terms of the micros, let's do this quickly. We have even the numbers. So let's give you the 1, the 2. So it's easier we have it ordered. The 4.
That's working.
And it's working. So just let me be clear, because we are using the, I also have problem in understanding the question that was how it was phrased. Okay, so, and I was so happy that you have problems too, because you're the only one. Exactly, shared problem is already part of the solution. That actually is a good point. So the point here is that I think as a clinician, I don't want, what I want is not that we just, take one road and align and change our way of working. So this is not the point. So it's actually very important that each one of us sitting at this table is looking at the, at the issue, at the product, or the discussion in, with our own competency. The problem is that why do we share these different views at the very beginning of the process? Because then if the evidence for me is enough, but for Michael is not, I really need to understand. We really need to understand what to do. So this is for me the key point. I don't want Michael to change and start, using parameters that actually are not, are in the remit of someone else. So the point is, each one should start. And then if there is something that clearly is wrong, we can work and adapt and see together. But the point is not change our views or the way we look at the issue that is in discussion, but is try to understand how can we actually complement better and earlier what we think of the drugs that we are discussing.
Just to complete with an initiative with MEDEV, which has been in place for quite a few years now, which is called MOCA, the Mechanism of Coordinated Access to Orphan Medicinal Products, which is precisely what you comment. Early discussions between the developer and payers about the same time as scientific advice is obtained and discussed with regulators, where the developer can confront the data they will get and the uncertainties they will have at a very early development stage of the product. They can also then have early discussions with HTA, of course, and come back to MOCA. But so this is happening, but I agree it should be more systematic on a much larger scale and with more efforts to sustain this early dialogue.
Carol.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Carol Longson, Professor and Independent Advisor in Health Technology Assessment. My question is directed primarily at Michael, but not exclusively, because I think Michael touched a theme that many others have brought up, and that is about the how to maximize the impact of early dialogue across the entire chain between regulation and health technology assessment and access. And one of the things, we have lots of tools to do that. We have methodologies, we have mechanisms for early scientific dialogue and parallel scientific dialogue. But what I've not been seeing over the years, and I was there at the first dialogue, that's a very long time ago, and I'm not sure how much has moved in the translation of all of the tools and the advice into an evidence generation environment that is actually serving the needs of the regulators and the health technology assessment bodies. And so my question, based on quite a lot of the comments that the panel have made, is, are there one or two key things that we still need to do to make most use of the mechanisms we already have, and particularly inside the UNETA and EMA collaboration, to translate what you are saying into changes in evidence development during the drug development process, because that's what I'm not really seeing rapid change in. And it would be great to do that, because I think that would absolutely change the dial on speed to access, because you cut down the gap between regulation decision and access decision, because most of that is about evidence. Sorry it took so long to say that.
No, but use number 5, if that's helpful. Thanks, Carol, for asking the question, and good to see you again, by the way. And it's really at the heart of this conversation. I really would also hope that in the breakout groups we go more into it. And I think Marc's also already excited, so I'll pass on the microphone in a second. I think You're absolutely right. There is something which needs to gain further momentum. And there's a number of reasons. But I think we have a good starting point, as you were saying. We have done also the first analyses, which have been published, as you know. We know the areas where there are specific challenges in coming to a combined view or harmonized view or aligned view, if you will. Mostly around the comparator. But that's maybe not unsurprisingly. We have seen there was some uptake also of the recommendations. We've done these analyses previously. There's two elements which I would suggest to go to put into the discussion. The first one is a question of capacity. And whilst this is something which might be a bit sort of stiff, I think it's an important one, because we need to have sufficient capacity to run these dialogues, because they are essential. We are basically all saying the same thing. We need to discuss early enough in order to get the right evidence base. But if the capacity isn't there to allow these discussions to happen, then we might get stuck. So this one I would really like to put first. Now, looking forward, the regulation gives us, of course, a more sustainable framework under which then these discussions can happen. So this regulation should support addressing one of these challenges. Will it completely address? Well, that's actually what we will be seeing, because there's also certain selection criteria, for example, which may become an obstacle then. But the opportunities, the obstacle, the capacity challenges are one thing. The second one I would put into the equation is to learn from failures in the system. And I put the term failures maybe in a provocative way here, because there are certain groundbreaking technologies, maybe gene therapies. We need to look at where are the evidence gaps that were coming all along the way, which led to obstacles. Could we have prevented certain discussions and certain diverse views by having earlier discussions on these? So this being said, would be therefore used at this point in time as a trigger for going into early dialogues or parallel joint scientific consultations. Those products which will also go under the HTA regulation firsthand. We know it will be a stepwise implementation. It will be first ATMPs alongside oncology products, followed by orphans. Now we're currently having a tranche of joint scientific consultations together with United 21. And it's, for me, positive to see that 50% of those which are currently in joint scientific consultation are, for example, orphan medicines. So I think it all goes in the right direction, but to address capacity challenges and to learn from concrete cases where it has gone suboptimal, I would say, are key starting points to then get to a stronger system. But we have the tools in our hands. And maybe Marc with some additional reflections.
Yes, thank you. Some additional things. I agree with what you said, by the way. But there are some papers on the effects of early consultations and the effect later on, also on the alignment of different HTA bodies. And indeed, it is on the comparator. If we take the PICO word, the C of comparator is indeed an issue. But do we always need to be aligned all over Europe with all HTA bodies on the C? I'm not sure. But for me, important in this letter word is the O, the outcome. What outcome can we expect at the moment of launch? Clinical outcome, I mean. What clinical outcome can we expect? Is it a soft endpoint? Is it a kind of neurologic scale? Is it a kind of hard endpoint, etc.? And this will drive the discussion also later on, also after the decision making on additional data to be collected, etc. So the O of PICO is also a key word, a key letter, sorry, in this early scientific consultation in my eyes.
Just want to build on, and Carol, I liked your idea of a systems thinking all the way through, and I think it's really important that we have different decision makers along the process, if that's starting in the laboratory through to sort of the early advice, the regulatory, HTA, ultimately payers and the appraisal, and And then finally, we shouldn't lose sight of this, that doctor-patient decision-making itself, where they may look at a whole variety, if we think of outcomes, a whole variety of outcomes there. One thing that, personally I want to make sure is everybody's needs are sort of incorporated in that. That doesn't necessarily mean we need to, where there's harmonization, that's good. But what the regulators look at really should be what the HTA assessment itself looks at. There may be additional things, but let's not filter out things like outcomes at a HTA level. That's a responsibility, accountability at member state level when they're doing the appraisal. And note that that work at a HTA, European HTA level, can also have benefit at the patient-clinician level as well. So let's think around what is that interaction, what is the criteria that they're talking about as well. Because they will talk about clinical endpoints, they will talk about, if we think of oncology, overall survival, quality of life, safety, but all of that is an important topic to them. So the systems thinking really resonated with me.
Bettina Rühl, Melanoma Patient Network Europe. So first, I would like to challenge that ORR is not a patient-relevant endpoint. If you spend time on patient forums, and I do that a lot, you would know that patients celebrate any stable scan. And that is just response. Stable, if you don't get a response, stable means you're not progressing and you're not dead yet. So that is benefit. But of course, you want stable scan after stable scan after stable scan, which then becomes OS. So that means that there isn't one single endpoint, but I think of them as a landscape of things we first have to collect and then we improve over time. As a patient, you have to take decisions to go on a treatment, to get off a treatment. You have that one point in time. You are not the same patient as the patient we see in 2 years or in 3 years or in 5 years, because most likely you're going to be dead. So for a patient, it is critical that at the moment in time the decision is made, it is the optimal decision, considering all uncertainty that every stakeholder has. The highest one is for the patient in the point. So that brings me to the question to you, and I really loved Rosa's slide, even despite the mess up in there, because it is about the entire pathway. We start from research, and in the end, we want benefit in a patient. So that's an entire pathway across, what Carol said, a complex adaptive system, actually. We'll talk about all alignment. What I'm missing in there is a little bit, it's too much for me, it's too voluntary. So we're all nice, we like each other, so we have an agreement, but when it comes to it, everyone can chicken out. So who is responsible for making this entire process work, and who takes the accountability for it? We might think of different situations. Take Parkinson or take one of the rare diseases and take cancer. The solutions will look very different, most likely along the pathway. But what I want is something great landing into a patient, and who is going to be responsible, helping everyone to align, to provide the resources, find methodology. We need someone who's in charge. Who will that be according to you? Thank you.
Who is this question addressed to? To all?
Well, to be honest, I don't care. I want a solution. I want it to work. We have to, otherwise we will have, 10 years. Come on, we started in 2010, and we think this is good. It's 2020, that's 12 years later. As Rosa said, come on, we need a solution. So.
Anybody who wants to take the question?
Okay, no, it's actually, I completely agree on the points that were made. And I think it's Bettina's intervention is actually very well linked to Carol's intervention. Okay, so we are here, we've been here for a very long time discussing this voluntary participation, and there are the best intention on everybody's side. Okay, so it's not a criticism, but I think at a certain point we should try to make this voluntary, to push a little bit this voluntary participation and to make a standard process. So I'll give you an example. I always say, okay, we have the instruments, the tools. So just to make an example, scientific advice, okay? Personally, okay, as a medical oncologist, so I'm not saying that anything should change, okay? I don't want the system to implode, but I will make this as a mandatory requirement, okay? So, and it exactly goes along with the slide, my last slide. So the access to drugs starts in the lab. So that's the point where everybody should meet. And discuss, okay, let's have a look. We are developing this drug. Is that needed? Is the solution, is the formulation needed? Is bringing, benefit to patient? Which type of benefit? Because it's not just a matter of survival. Everybody of us wants to strong endpoints. Everybody, I mean, the point is have patients that live longer and better, okay? So this is the bottom line. But sometimes we need to adapt to the specific condition, okay? And there are improvements that can be, let's say, observed in a different way. At that point, very early, let's have this discussion. Let's call it scientific advice. I call it in my mind scientific advice. Let's have it in a mandatory way with all the problems that are related to the discussion at that point. But at least we know that the evidence that we are generating is good for Michael, is not good for the HTA. Okay, what does the HTA need? Do we really think that this is necessary? Yes, let's produce it. Let's plan it in advance. So this is what is missing in my opinion, and it should be like more of a systematic approach and maybe not so voluntary. I know that this is not a popular statement, but I've done it.
I just like to build on that. I think the point in there is that we should not allow ourselves no as an answer. And the solution, there's a lot of expertise and there will be difference. So there needs to be this flexibility that a colleague said we need to adopt, that we will need, because we will have new therapies that will be like something we've never seen before. To expect that the old tools will be fit for purpose, I think, is naive. It will not happen. If you think about checkpoint inhibitors, how long we discussed that because they behave differently than anything we had seen before, I think it's a missed opportunity. So, but should not be an answer. So that option should be off the table. So we need a solution, but how the solution looks like, flexibility. So, but who's responsible?
I think François and then Renato.
Quickly, voluntary or mandatory, there is the issue of resources, that's true, but that's not the only dimension. I think also the continuity of the information. From scientific advice and years later, CHMP, there is a loss of information. And the European Ombudsman had an inquiry, and some part of the society we know request that those providing the advice are different people from those assessing the product. And I think that is not a good idea. Having had the chance of taking part in CHMP discussions, it was so useful to have someone who took part in the scientific advice years before to explain why they gave the advice. And the same needs to be done with HTA experts. It's not okay if they just receive a document explaining the advice that was given years before without the proper explanation. So maybe to improve the documents explaining the advices that were given and why, but we not have immediately all the HTA people we need to take part in all scientific advice meetings at the EMA. It will take resources and time, but at least we should ensure that those who do the joint scientific advice or joint consultations can also take part in CHMP discussions and then HTA assessments. Otherwise, we can lose part of the thinking.
Great, thank you. I think that we really need a final assessment, and this must be based on all the elements coming earlier, scientific advice or early consultation. But I think that the need of this, let's call it group of work, if you want, should be, the objective should be to complete a sort of, I will call arbitrarily, algorithm in which every drug must be inserted with the courage of accepting the final result is okay or is not okay. This is the only way that I think pragmatically one can achieve an objective such as the real assessment of a new drug, any field. So you were talking about ORR, is that so? there will be a final result, and that's it. Because this algorithm should take into account the amount of uncertainty, should take into account what is the real benefit for the patients, at least in models or based upon the first data outcome from the clinical trial. And so only this is the way to go out of this kind of labyrinth, because otherwise we always find a point where we'll remain stuck with, And so we have to accept that, we all have to accept that a number of drugs, we were referring to gene therapy before, would not be effective in the real life. And this is another point, to project real-life models, to harmonize those methodologies, because today we cannot benefit of real-life data, not entirely at least as we would like to, because there is no harmonized methodology on that. That would be very helpful. Who are the excellence centers who are acquainted in collecting data in the proper way, applying proper methodologies, and this would harmonize, for example, in the example of the European Union, many countries that today are not harmonized because of economical disequality, because of also ethnical disequality, which is a medical element that must be kept in due account.
Next was Mira.
I think that Monsieur Bernardini has said almost everything, so I have just a small comment to add, which is that being first regulator, then HTA, then independent electron, I think that HTA bodies are flexible. And I think also that new treatments create new endpoints that become accepted. For example, in melanoma, you have now acceptance of long disease-free survival, etc., because there are things that evolve over time, and I think that alignment is not a word, but there is more common thinking. Thank you.
Peter, is this a question or this was a comment? Comment. Peter? No, it's not on yet. 4.
I think. Yep. Peter Mol, I'm a regulator and a professor of drug regulatory science, and as a regulator, actually just came back from discussing about 80 clinical development programs this week, and that is in the scientific advice. And obviously, I think I really want to re-emphasize that the practicalities of organizing this is huge. So that is one aspect, obviously, which is sort of in the background, but we need to also address that. And I agree, Bettina, we should not accept no, but we should try and find solutions to that. But there are limits at the system currently. What is very interesting is to see, I heard a discussion around the ORR, and it's not just ORR, it's a durability of response, obviously, that is playing a role. And yes, you can criticize, and I agree, and the dangling approvals. There were also 140 procedures where Pasteur made a claim that at least those 10 dangling are perhaps not so bad because all the others worked. But okay, so I think that's an important caveat. Still, every time in all these meetings that we have in scientific advice, we rediscuss the ORR, the single-arm trials. Is this still the state where we are? Should we ask something else, or do we have to look at the regulatory precedents and follow that? So every time that leads to discussion, it's not something that we take on lightly, and there's really each time a case-by-case analysis. And I think that is also going to happen for your joint clinical advice or assessments, scientific advices, also at HTA level. But moving beyond that, that would be my question to the panel is, can at least when you do this joint assessments or those joint advises agree on the level of data that you want to collect afterwards, and not so much on doing that in Germany, doing that in Italy, doing that in Spain, but can we also try and think of doing that more collaboratively? Because I think these would help us so much. I always look a little bit wary at, okay, we're going to look at the oral anticoagulants in the Netherlands, what the effect size are. And I think they've just done a 20,000 person trial. Why do we do that in one single country? And I think that is more the case even if you look at rare diseases. So that is what I would ask the panel here.
Yep. It's a really good question. I'm really glad you brought it up, because as I was listening to the discussion as well, and we talk about scientific advice, this is a continuum of evidence generation, and over time we reduce uncertainty on these things. And a lot of times scientific advice is, are we going to tell you what endpoint you need, or what population, or what comparator you are? And actually the real value of scientific advice is also, where are the evidence gaps? Where's the remaining uncertainty? And what's the solution from a regulatory, from a developer, from a HTA perspective? What is the solution to fill in those gaps? There is no way, even from an ethical perspective, to run a clinical trial that might have 8 or 9 comparators in. Quite clearly, some of those comparators may be relevant in some countries, but actually they're not the best available, and ethically that's hard to randomize somebody into a suboptimal treatment itself. So that creates an evidence gap that we will need to fill. What are the solutions for that? And some of those solutions will be available at the regulatory time point, at the HTA assessment time point. Some of them, by the time it gets down to the member state to do their own sort of appraisal of that. But quite a lot of that's going to be longer term as well. So it's, what's the solution once we're at a country level where we can plug those gaps, and where are those gaps can be done at a European level rather than country by country as well. So I think there's lots of opportunities there. We might need to reframe some of the thinking along that in the context of the EU HTA itself. But I'll pass over to the panel if there's any.
Michael.
Michael, yeah.
Thank you. First, thanks for the question. I think it's such a crucial one. And from what you were saying, I do agree we need to connect these dots, but I would really invite to have these discussions early in the development program. If one knows there is a development towards, I now use regulatory terms, conditional marketing authorization, we have to have early enough the discussion also around the uncertainties and therefore the post-licensing evidence generation plan in concrete terms. And Peter, you know how many of these concrete plague proposals we get with a view of the development program aiming for CMA. And it's not just for regulatory purposes, it's also for the HTA and downstream decision-making that we need to get around the table and have these discussions early. And I think this is really where the invitation should go to. So Bettina, you were asking for solutions. I don't think it's necessarily one solution for everything, but I think we should use existing tools we are having. It's always collectively getting stronger together. Of course, I have to bring here into the mix the PRIME scheme, the priority medicine scheme. Why do I bring this in? Because it allows for an early discussion of a development program, which ideally should be comprehensive. We always ask also in this context for where are the discussions with HTA colleagues, for example. We would like to see this in the development tracker. A new concept after our 5-year review will be the establishment of a development tracker for each individual compound to be managed by the company, but as a result of a kickoff meeting with regulators, and from there also involving hopefully others from the decision-making chain. Of course, there's an element of which products get into the PRIME scheme. So do we all agree on the same priorities to address an unmet need? And we can have a long discussion about unmet need, but I don't think the chairs want us to at this point. But it's something which is challenging, but it is also an important one to have with the other stakeholders together. But I think it is an existing tool, and that's where I would like to get to. And also we're now introducing something like a readiness meeting for submissions at the right point in time. So these are things which are being built on the experience, and of course they can get stronger and stronger over time. The other element I would just like to briefly bring in is the notion I heard earlier. It's not about giving a report to the next decision maker. And we have had really good experience under Joint Action 3 in the production at the time with webinars between HTA authors and the regulatory assessors. Really good discussions where basically there was an exchange on how were regulators looking at the evidence, why did they come to a certain label, which uncertainties did they see, and from there already starting a discussion on what are now our requirements for post-licensing at this point in time. And again, knowing that it may have been better discussed even earlier in the program, but that's a side conversation. But these webinars, these direct discussions between regulators and HTA authors are hugely important. And last but not least, real-world evidence. And then I think you're absolutely right. We need to connect the dots here. And I think initiatives like Darwin EU, which brings together the various data sources which we have in terms of healthcare records, amongst others, which allows through a coordination center to then answer questions which come from concrete assessments are extremely important. It will go into the European health data space. And just a few days ago, we had a workshop together with HTAs and payer representatives on how Darwin EU can also support use cases which are relevant for HTA and payer decision-making, because this is ultimately where this goes to. So again, back to Bettina, I think there are so many initiatives, there's so much work which we really need to connect, be aware of, and engage in these opportunities. And I think they really make this all stronger. Thank you.
On that topic, thank you, Marc, for keeping us almost like in time. So as you see on the agenda, so 10:30 has passed. So we have to conclude this session. Before we, I invite you to the coffee break that we have upstairs. I would like to thank the panel members for their contribution and in the Q&A session. So thank you.